Thank you very much, Kathleen, for that, the invitation to be here. I'm excited to be here. It's always great to get out of Washington, and I'm honored to be here to provide a lecture on one aspect of globalization. As Kathleen mentioned, I've been at CRS for over 3 decades. Now, when I started at CRS, I was 6'7". So you guys are all into the sciences, you know the math. How many inches per 4 years have I shrunk? It's about 1/4 inch per year. And that shrinkage, I think, has accelerated over the last few years. Anyone imagine why that is the case? What's going on in Washington today? Who knows the answer to that? Are things getting done? No, okay. So there's been stalemate, and that's contributed, I think, to my accelerating shrinkage. But as Kathleen mentioned, I work for a nonpartisan entity that's located in the Library of Congress called the Congressional Research Service. So we try to provide unbiased, objective research for our members of Congress. And we work for both the majority and the minority. We are called upon, in terms of requests, about 1,500 times per day to answer some requests for information or analysis of legislation. We're a group of about 600, and we do keep quite busy. I still enjoy the job, if you believe that, after all these years, because the issues keep changing, and I work with some great colleagues, so I couldn't be happier. Kathleen mentioned that I was Dr. Ahern, but mistakenly. Unfortunately, I'm not, because if I was a doctor, I wouldn't be at CRS today. I would be probably teaching somewhere, but I don't want to disparage the occupation of teacher or professor. It's probably a good life, but at least I've found the life in Washington to be exciting. So I'm going to go through this PowerPoint presentation. If you have questions, just please raise your hand while I'm presenting. Many of you know more about these issues than I do. I like to say I'm a generalist. A lot of the members and professional staff we tend to brief know very little about what they need to know, so they ask us. So we get up to speed on the issue, and we know just a little bit more. So I'm sure I'll be touching upon some issues that all of you know more than I do, particularly when it comes to the commodity price issue. So if you have confusion, or if you have questions you want to interject or ask while I'm making the presentation, please raise your hand. If not, we'll just go through the presentation, and we'll have questions after the lecture is concluded. But I do prefer it if you interact while I'm talking. I think it's livelier that way. Now, I'm not an expert on this particular topic, as I just said. The rising economic powers. You know, that term was coined. About 7 years ago, and it wasn't the rising economic powers. A economist at Goldman Sachs started talking about the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So when I wrote this report about 3 months ago, I decided to not call them the BRICS, but the rising economic powers. Anyone have a clue as to why I might want to do that? Why not copy what someone else has already coined in terms of a moniker? I want to be famous. Oh, Kathleen.
That's actually one of my dreams too, is to create a term.
Yeah, just create a term no one else has used. But then
I was going to say that one answer would be that the BRICS are changing.
The BRICS are changing, yeah. And so you could talk about the BRICS and the near BRICS, and that becomes kind of cumbersome. So I'm going to talk about the rising economic powers and how these powers are really changing the global economy and the global economic landscape. So why don't we start now, Kathleen? Go to the first slide. The point here is, after you leave the lecture today, I want you to at least remember these few points. These are the takeaways. So these fast-growing and large economic powers, and I'll define them essentially as, does everyone hear me? Because I'm not using the mic. China certainly is on top. India and Brazil are next in line. And then there's Russia. And then coming on strong, I think, are Mexico, Indonesia, and Turkey. You can quibble about the others, but we'll show data that indicate that developing countries in the aggregate are also part of this shift. The shift in power, the shift in economic wealth. When I was in graduate school years ago, we only thought of the United States and Europe when it came to sort of management of the global economy. Today, clearly, the balance of global economic power has shifted, and most projections are that that trend will accelerate in the future. These rising economic powers are also becoming important players in international finance. We used to think of the West, Europe, and the United States, as having a dominant position in global banking, insurance, and other financial institutions. But today, as the rising economic powers increase their trade surpluses, they're becoming wealthier. And their companies are also becoming, the multinational companies are playing a more prominent role on the global scene. So the long-standing distinction between developed countries and developing countries is beginning to blur. We used to talk about the third world. How many people use that term today? Does anyone use that term today, the third world? No. What's a developing country? What's a developed country? When you look at what's going on in Europe today and in Greece, the problems Greece is having, is that a developed country or are they a developing country? They certainly are in need of financial resources. Clearly, these countries are having a major impact on the US economy, which is highly debated in terms of the bottom line. And they pose varied challenges and opportunities for US policymakers, which is a good thing. Because that keeps people like myself in business, because we're supposed to be doing policy. So I'll go through some data that shows that these countries are accounting for a rising share of global GDP, rising share of global manufacturing, and a rising share of trade in commodities. They're, in terms of the financial side, they're increasing their holdings of foreign exchange reserves, establishing sovereign wealth funds, which during the 08, 09 financial crisis turned out to be highly useful to many of our failing financial companies because these sovereign wealth funds invested in those companies, kept them from failing. They're attracting foreign investment. They're also becoming increasingly foreign investors to the outside world. And they're competing with US multinational companies. They're exerting greater influence in the international economic institutions created in the post-war period, so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. And most importantly, they're competing for jobs. What's our unemployment rate today? 9%. 9% out of a labor force of 130 million means we've got 13 million people looking for work, another 3-4 million people giving up on looking for work. So there's nothing more important than jobs when it comes to economic policy issues for members of Congress, and that's at the top of their list. So what are these policy challenges I'm talking about? The first is the rising economic powers, of course, are creating hundreds of millions of new middle-class consumers. They also have governments that have the resources available to spend on roads, transportation, and infrastructure. So the question is, how can the United States take better advantage of these growing markets? At the same time, we have to prepare for increased competition. The world's not getting any easier. Tom Friedman writes about this so eloquently in his books, The Olive Tree and the Nexus, The World is Flat, and this new one that's just come out with Michael Mandelbaum. When I was a kid growing up, the competition was maybe 20 miles down the road. For my kids and for you guys, the competition is global. Tom Friedman used to say that when he was growing up, his parents told him, hey, you got to hurry up and finish your supper because the kids from China and the kids from India are hungry. You don't want to leave, food on the table. And now he says to his kids, hey, hurry up and finish your supper. You got to get to your homework because the kids from China and the kids from India want to take your jobs. Well, it's not that simple, but the point is the global competition has increased, and it's a tougher world. In many ways, I feel blessed that I grew up when I did. There's some benefits to being old, and one is that life was a lot easier when I got out of college than the world you guys are facing, although you're in a very good position compared to a lot of the kids that are just coming out of liberal arts schools. Yes, sir?
Just a quick question. Are you referring to the U.S. middle class or the middle class of the IEP?
I'm referring to the middle class of the REPs. So the projections, what's middle class? I don't know. Anywhere from $5,000 a year in per capita income to $30,000 a year. And if you look at India and China, basically you've got an emerging middle class of hundreds of millions of consumers. That's the point. It's not a very sophisticated one, I agree. But the Doha round is a big deal. And why completing the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations is important? Because it's the heart of the multilateral trading system. And one of the reasons that the Doha round has been stalemated for over 10 years is because of the growing power of the rising economic powers. We'll talk about that later. At the same time, the U.S. has to worry about addressing more interventionist policies of and export-led growth strategies of the rising economic powers. It's not as if these governments aren't practicing state capitalism, where our overriding philosophy still tends to be laissez-faire. Let the markets decide winners and losers, whereas these countries, by and large, I know it's a broad generalization, are out there practicing industrial policies. The big issue is how to get the rising economic powers to take on more responsibilities in these international economic institutions. They have more power and they want to play a larger role. But the question is, what is their vision for the international economy in the future? Remains to be seen, at least when it comes to China. Finally, the issue is how to deal with resource scarcity if the rising economic power's voracious commodity demand outstrips supply. Yes?
I'm going to get to this. You mentioned earlier that you're not just saying the BRIC countries, but other countries as well. Are we going to get to see a map of which countries belong to the rising?
When I write my next report.
So which other countries would you add to that list?
Well, I would add, right now, you start with the BRICS. I'm not sure I would include South Africa. It's in part of the BRICS, but is it really, the criteria is fast-growing, large country, large in terms of population. Because the fact of the matter is, you need to have a large population if you're going to have an impact on the global economy. So I would cut it off at 100 million. So that would mean China, India, Brazil, Russia, although their population is declining. It's about 115 million now, I believe. Turkey, Mexico, and Indonesia. Those are the 7 I would include in the list. And it's arbitrary, totally arbitrary. All right? So now, any other questions? So we'll go to the data now and look at the shifts that have occurred and the projections of what will occur in the future. We'll start first with the world GDP rankings and distribution. So here we see that the advanced country share of world GDP is dropping from 80% to 57% from the 1960 to 72 period to the 2008-2009 period. That's a 23% drop. And the emerging economies share, and this is from a Brookings study, and I think their definition of emerging economies was some 20 countries, so a broader sample than what I'm using. Their share rose from 17% to 39%, which is a 22% increase. And that's over the last 50 years.
Let me also just say that I can get anybody the PowerPoint slides if you'd like. So feel free to just email me if you'd like a copy.
And then give me feedback on how I could do it better next time. That would be appreciated. Or what slides that I don't have on there that might be helpful for making the case. So here we see the shift in economic power being projected to accelerate over the next 20 years. This is from an OECD study, Shifting Wealth. It was entitled Shifting Wealth. So the OECD sees developing countries' share of the global economy being equal by next year. But by 2030, you see a significant gap developing where non-member economies of the will account for 57% of global GDP, and OECD member countries will account for 43%. And that's in purchasing power parity dollars.
Why use PPP for this measurement?
Well, PPP accounts, it's not, the other measurement is simply nominal exchange rates, market values. PPP will take into account the greater amount a dollar can buy in these countries. So that a dollar, for example, in India goes further than a dollar in the United States because of the lower costs of services, such as medicine, haircuts, massages, whatever else you want to get. So this is probably a more accurate measure for most purposes, but there are some times when you just want to use market-based exchange rates. And on the next slide, we see world GDP distributed by country. It's kind of a busy slide. Again, this is from Brookings. Emerging market study. Here we see that the United States has remained the largest economy in the world, although its share has dropped 9% from 33% in that 1960 to 72 period to 24% during the 1986 to 2009 period. You also see the share of the G7 and the EU, let me see, it's the EU 15 dropping even more rapidly. And the share, but the three largest rising economies, China, India, and Brazil, see their shares rise from 6 to 17%. Of course, among the rising economic powers, China is in a class of its own. So it's You always have to remember that. I mean, it probably accounts for 70% of most of these changes in the global economy, whether it's production, trade, that we're talking about. And in this slide, you see the projection that China was about a quarter the size of our economy in real GDP terms in 2009, but it's projected to be 20% larger by 2050. Yes?
Would this be derived from the fact that Chinese government's keeping their currency low?
Yeah, I mean, that would, well, you mean the projection or the?
For having their economy, keeping their balance currency so low, they're able to produce goods cheaper, so they're able to export more. Would that be a major cause in why China's economy is
Well,
growing so
yeah,
fast?
China does operate an export-led economy, and the undervaluation of the renminbi is a factor in its growth rate. How much of a factor of that 10% it's been averaging over the last 10 years, I really can't say, but it's a model that they adopted, and it's been very successful. But the Chinese authorities also recognize that they're going to have to change that model and try to grow more through increases in internal demand, internal consumption over time. And gradually they're trying to do that. Yes?
I don't know if they included this, but I mean, it's pretty evident to some geologists and research people that China's going to hit a bubble real fast here as far as the resources go. In the next even 10 to 15 years, that I don't know that this really reflects that. They're going to run out of coal, they're low on oil, they're going to have to do something. And compared to the U.S., we have vast resources that they don't have.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and the last slide will pick up on this point where I will provide various caveats, to these kinds of projections, which are basically linear forecasts of existing trends, which there are all kinds of, internal impediments China faces to continued growth, and we have our own challenges, to overcome domestically, and if we do better than is predicted and China does worse, obviously that gap will be much less pronounced than you're seeing here in terms of future trends. Here we see also importantly China, India, and Brazil accounting for an increasing share of world economic growth. So the first bar chart shows what the world economic growth was, but you can see that the contribution, relative contribution of the advanced countries' economies to global growth has declined over time. It's falling from 70% during the 1973 to 85 period to 57% in the 86 to 2007 period. And then, of course, during the financial or global economic recession, it fell to 6%, 2008, 2009. And China, India, and Brazil's contributions have gone from 11 to 12 to 22%, and then to 71% during that last period, 2008, 2009. So the world has increasingly had to rely on the growth of these emerging economies, rising economic powers, which is incredibly important. Unsurprisingly, the location of manufacturing is also shifting from industrialized, advanced countries to the rising economic powers. We often use the term factory Asia, and the shift has been most pronounced in Asia. Manufacturing value added per capita has increased nearly sixfold in China since 1990. It stagnated in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. And last year, China overtook the United States as the world's largest producer of manufactured goods. This trend, the development of manufacturing located in Asia is driven, of course, by offshoring and outsourcing of production. Supply chains now dominate the production of goods, and they incorporate value added from countries all around the world, whether it's a laptop, cars, airplanes, whatever. And it's not occurring simply in Asia, which has been facilitated by free trade agreements throughout Asia, but obviously in the United States, all our big producers, such as Boeing, incorporate parts and components from around the world. Here you see a picture, an example of the Boeing 787. So you've got parts being sourced from the UK, Japan, Italy, the UK, Korea, Italy, Sweden, Japan. Well, nothing from China, surprise. But even in all those parts, the components probably come from different countries. Some of the outsourcing obviously is for non-commercial, commercial reasons, but with a political angle. Why would the Boeing want to have the some of the major parts and systems made, say, in Japan or Italy?
Risk sharing.
Risk sharing, good. Also, with an eye to future customers. A lot of these airline industries around the world are government owned or with a lot of government ownership. And to get sales helps if you are buying some of the components from these countries. But this is not all necessarily a good deal for Boeing, because they started the production of the Boeing 787 about 7-8 years ago. And when you have sourcing from around the world, oftentimes it doesn't work out well because the parts don't fit together, the systems aren't compatible. And this has really been a real problem for Boeing, leading to a lot of delays in the delivery of the 787. Here, in terms of patterns of international trade flows, we find that the developing countries' share is rising, not surprisingly, from 23% in 1990 to 45% 2010. Some predict the share will rise to 70% by 2050. Much of the rise is due to the expansion of exports from developing countries to other developing countries, so-called South-South trade. That's risen by 9% in 1990 to 20% of global trade in 2008. And Asia here again accounts for 75% of South-South trade. So, why does that matter, South-South trade? Developing countries are trading a lot more with each other. Yeah.
I mean, there's a currency implication. If they're trading their own currencies back and forth, there's less of a dependence on the dollar as a currency. So that's one component, but that's probably auxiliary to what you're going at.
No, I think that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Then but most of the trade is priced in dollars, and they're not. China now is pricing some of the trade in yuan, but most of the trade is priced in dollars. Yeah.
That would be that if the South-South trading is increased and there's less North-South trading, they're not as dependent on northern markets, therefore they can rise in power in the G77 and the WTO.
Yeah, excellent.
They're not
Yeah.
as dependent upon it.
Yeah, that's what I had in mind, and I think that's probably part of the shift. And also, the question is how we U.S. producers and investors, can take advantage of this growing shift that's occurring. You know. Here you see exports by region. So if one adds developing countries' exports to developed countries, so-called south-north trade, to south-south trade, you can see that developing countries accounted for 37% of global exports in 2008, which is a 14 percentage share increase from the 1990 share of 23%. And we're also seeing, as a part of this phenomenon, this new international trade patterns, rising trade in intermediate goods. World exports of these inputs have doubled between 95 and 2009. And of course, this reflects the proliferation of production supply chains. And Asia again takes the lead. That's where the supply chain seems to be centered. And it does reflect the unbundling of this production process. You know, when I was in graduate school, we thought of nationally based industries where products were and inputs, products were made and input sourced for those products within the country, so that there was such a thing as U.S. goods being exported to the rest of the world. Pascal Lamy, the head of the World Trade Organization, recently said that there's no such thing anymore as a national product. What we have are world products. But this is some of the data that supports those kinds of claims, I think. Here's, this is from, I didn't footnote this, but it's from a World Trade Organization report. As the figure shows, Asia's share of world trade in intermediate goods exports has increased from 26% in 1995 to 35% in 2009, while the share of North America and Europe has declined. And of course, this again is the function of supply chains and free trade agreements in Asia. Now here we come to just a few points about commodity trade, which you all know a lot more about than I do, but I just wanted to weave this into the presentation so I wouldn't be considered totally incompetent and negligent. And here, I'm going to talk about commodity price surges over the past decade. Much of the increase, of course, has been driven by the huge infrastructure developments and urbanization needs of India and China. Impact of the growth and the rising economic powers is seen with long-term declines in the global intensity use of a wide range of commodities. And of course, as countries grow richer, per capita consumption of resources increases not only for metals and energy, but also for food. So in the first slide here we see commodity price increases over the past decade. The rising demand in commodities due in large part to the impressive growth of China and India beginning around the year 2000. Rising demand is making it difficult for technological advances to allow production, obviously, to catch up with demand. In the next slide, we see long-term declines in intensity use being reversed around the year 2000. Intensity use for each of the commodities has declined during that period and then started to increase, with the exception of, looks like oil is flatlining and coal moderate increase. You all probably can explain that to me, what's going on there and why that's happening, and why the intensity use for the other commodities seems to be accelerating. But clearly, their economic development is highly resource intensive during this phase of development for building, as I said, infrastructure and other industrial uses. And this next slide, I think, shows the same story. The time periods of it aren't shown. I don't know why that didn't come out, but the first column should be, I think it's, first column is 1980 to 2000, and the second column is 2000 to 2008. So emerging markets are driving almost all of the additional demand or consumption growth. Then as countries grow wealthier, per capita consumption of resources does increase sharply, not only for metals or energy consumption, but also for agricultural products, food. The rise in per capita consumption is most intense in Asia. And on the next slide, I show rather dramatically China taking over 60% of the global soybean import market. So this does again reflect China's adoption of a more meat-based diet as it grows wealthier, with consumption of feed crop like soybeans soaring. I'll go over the shifts in international finance more rapidly. Rising economic powers are accumulating foreign exchange reserves. Developing countries held 67% of total foreign exchange reserves as of last year, and they account for now 51% of foreign holdings of US T-bills. Their foreign direct investment inflows and outflows have increased, and their multinational corporations are growing in importance, as represented by a number of indicators I have in the slide. Again, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, what all this means is that here's an area that was once considered within the purview, within the dominance of advanced countries, and now certainly after the accelerated by the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and concurrent with these other trends, we see that that dominance now is not as solid. Next slide shows just one indicator of the growing innovation that is coming from mostly multinational companies and the rising economic powers. And obviously, innovation is so important to growth as countries reach a more advanced stage of development. So we'll turn now to some of the policy trends policy issues raised by these trends. The first is, how is the United States going to take advantage of growing markets? Secondly is, how are we going to prepare for increased competition? Third, how can we use trade negotiations to advance our interests? Fourth, how can we reconsider traditional international trade stats, given that most products are world products and not national-based products? How can we develop better rules for foreign direct investment? What are some of the issues dealing with commodity price increases? And finally, what are some of the issues involved in reforming the international economic institutions? Taking advantage of growing markets, we're trying to do that. The Obama administration 2 years ago announced a national export initiative. The idea was to develop, double US exports in 5 years, so that more efforts are being put into exporting. And given the state of the US economy, why is that important, do you think? Why do we need exports?
Low domestic demand.
Low domestic demand, meaning that
We need purchase somewhere.
well, consumers are retrenching. Government is spending less, so that most of the layoffs are occurring in the public sector, state and local governments primarily. The businesses are sitting on a couple $1 trillion of retained earnings but aren't investing. So that leaves exports as the only real source of growth for our economy and the source for job creation. So it's net exports we're talking about. The markets are out there. They're growing, but they're hard to penetrate, so that the United States needs to undertake, this is again not a new issue, but we have to undertake increased efforts at penetrating these markets, at going global, at selling more, because clearly there will be rising demand for many of the products we produce, and some of them are going to be niche products. Others will be capital goods, tractors, and stuff that big companies make. Most of our exports do come from small and medium-sized business. I mean, most of our exporters are small and medium-sized businesses. And to get involved in exporting today, they increasingly need to access supply chains. So they're not going to necessarily be selling their inputs directly abroad, but they've got to, be part of this production process. And that oftentimes takes new information that government can provide, and that's some of what the Obama administration is trying to do in terms of this new export initiative. Preparing for increased competition, that's a big issue, we know, actually, at least if you'd been involved in producing goods in the industrial heartland, increased competition is nothing new, whether you're an auto producer, a steel producer, or so forth. You've been through that. It's not easy to compete, and we know that competition, as these rising economic powers try to go up the value chain, is going to increasingly affect more of our producers. Lastly, I say that we need to open up now these foreign markets to our exports of services. And I say that because I didn't really explain it there. There's a recent study by Michael Spence, who won a Nobel Prize for economics. He did this for the Council of Foreign Relations. And in this study, Spence divides the US economy into two sets of jobs. Jobs that are domestic in nature and are not outsourceable and subject to international competition, and those that are subject to international competition, and so that can be displaced by the global economy. And he found that over a 20-year period, ending in 2008, that 97% of our net jobs were derived from jobs not subject to international competition. So that less than 3% of our jobs in the manufacturing sector and in services area, where financial services that are tradable and subject to international competition, only 3% of the net jobs were created there. So we got a big problem, if in fact his data is right. Big problem is that we need jobs, and most of the jobs, when it comes to jobs that can't be outsourced, are due to government spending, due to healthcare and the like, and these are the sectors that are going to be cut by our need to reduce our budget deficit. So what we can do is try to increase our exports of services where we do have a competitive advantage today. There's nothing new in that statement, but I think the urgency of doing it is even greater today, because if we can't do that, export these products to countries that are benefiting from trade with the United States, it's going to be a real issue for job creation in the United States long run. And of course, increased competition always brings with it a cry for leveling the playing field. We hear that all the time. How many people have been listening to the Republican presidential primary debates? And have you heard anything about international trade in these debates? What did Mitt Romney say about China in these debates? Anyone know? He says you got to take a harder line on China. China's taking unfair advantage of the United States. You got to be tougher. And we got to enforce our trade laws, says Romney. Now, you think that claim and that sentiment has ever been shared by other politicians previously? Yes, it's nothing new. So when you don't know what to do, you've got a real competitive dilemma. Politicians always, of both parties, say, playing field is not even. We've got to enforce our trade agreements better. We've got to be more aggressive in making sure that our interests are well defended in the World Trade Organization. We see that all the time. And then we're seeing it again in the Republican primary. We saw it in the Democratic primary when Obama and Hillary Clinton were duking it out for the votes in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And they were outdoing each other on NAFTA. Barack said he was going to renegotiate NAFTA. Hillary said, that may be foolish, but we certainly have to reevaluate our trade agreements and whether they're serving our national interests. So this is part of this business of preparing for increased competition. And yes, Myrna.
What type of industries in your research are that U.S. has competitive advantage?
Well, economists will say that it's capital-intensive industries where a lot of high-skilled labor is brought to bear. Now, I have an example of the iPod, and we'll look at the iPod. But clearly the iPod and anything that is invented sort of in the United States is an industry where we are, or area we have a competitive advantage in. Everything that GE, a lot of what GE does, you know, but it's so hard to say because so much of what these big companies are doing now, only part of what they're doing is in the United States, and the rest is they're global companies, you know, so they're doing it all around the world. So the economist standard answer of our comparative advantage is in capital-intensive industries and where we need high-skilled labor force always kind of falls flat because I can't point to industries that are universally, you know, airline industry certainly, that would be a case. Heavy capital equipment, certainly. Pharmaceuticals, yes. Can you think of any others? Yeah. Yeah.
Does agriculture fall into
Agriculture, in a way, it's capital intensive. Yeah, it's capital intensive, low labor inputs in terms of not much employment. Yeah. Mining, okay. Extractive industries, yeah. So we have comparative advantage out there, and economists keep telling us that, and comparative advantage is supposed to dictate what we're trading. But at the same time, if we go back to one of the slides, we have to worry about the other guys being interventionists and shaping their comparative advantage. You know, comparative advantage isn't anything that's static. And this is because capital is mobile internationally. Labor's not, but money flows, technology flows, investments flow, labor's stationary by and large. So in this world economy, you want to be an owner of capital, and if you're going to try to earn money by source of wages, you've got to be creative. You got to compete with everyone else in the world, and you got to be educated, highly educated, highly skilled. That's sort of the conventional wisdom there. Now on the trade negotiation side, could talk about that for a long time. But in a way, the future of the world trading system, the multilateral trading system as we know it, based on non-discrimination, based on the most favored nation principle, is really at stake, with the stalemate in the Doha round, which is a function partly of the rising economic powers not wanting to eliminate some of their barriers to trade and investment. And as a result, many of these countries, you know, want to play a larger role in the world trading system, but you're not sure what their vision is. For example, China. I hate to keep picking on China, but was it 2 weeks ago, Greece is having this financial crisis, sovereign debt crisis, and China was sort of looked at as a possible source of revenue to pick up the slack in terms of purchases of not only Greek but Italian sovereign bonds and help stabilize the situation. But the Chinese finance minister made very clear that there'd be a quid pro quo for Chinese rescue package. And that quid pro quo was that the European Union would have to pledge not to impose restrictions on Chinese exports going to Europe. So it wasn't a vision of here we are, a world power, and as a world power, our responsibility is to maintain the system, the international economy, so that there'd be a free flow of trade and finance, and the system was good for everyone. This was sort of the view of the United States in the post-war period, and it didn't oftentimes, or didn't always, put its own narrow commercial interests first, but we see that a different vision perhaps might be adopted and pushed by China, which would have major implications for the kind of world trade system that evolves after the Doha round is finally declared dead. I don't know when they're going to do that, but eventually they've got to say enough is enough, 10, 11 years, we've got to conclude the round and move on. So in the meantime, the United States is involved in these negotiations in Asia called the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, and they're trying to deal with a lot of these new issues that supply chains raise for economic policy, and it's a very promising set of negotiations. The problem is that, the president doesn't have what's called negotiating authority. Congress is in charge of trade policy in the United States, according to the Constitution, and the Congress has not reauthorized the president to engage in these negotiations. The president can negotiate because he's the president, but he then can't bring these agreements back to Congress and get special expedited legislative treatment for these agreements that he concludes. And part of the reason, why can't the Congress, or why doesn't the Congress give the president what he would like to have on trade? Power, bargaining. What does the American public, how does the American public view trade? They real favorable for free trade, more trade, globalization? Public opinion polls, what do you think how do they come out in terms of the American public? Recently not good, you're right. And recently not very good at all. It's getting worse and worse. More than 50%, and now depending on how you cut it by, income, social bracket, education, blah, 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 job, more than 50% of the American public basically will answer, is trade good for the American economy or bad? They'll say bad. Is trade part of the problem we have in creating jobs or part of the answer? They'll say part of the problem. And more worrisome is the fact that it used to be high income, high educated people were on the side of saying no, trade is part of the solution. It's not part of the problem. But today the trend's going the other direction. Folks that are white collar types are worried about global competition. They're worried about their jobs being outsourced. And so you see this polling going in the other direction. So when it comes to trade agreements, and there are going to be 3 trade agreements acted on next week, the U.S.-South Korea free trade agreement with Panama, and one with Colombia, after 5 or 6 years of screwing around, because most members of Congress don't want to vote on a trade agreement, free trade agreement. Why would that be? So I had a friend that was working for the House Majority Leader 2 years ago. And the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative is in charge of U.S. trade policy. So whenever the Congressional Liaison Officer was in the hall of the Cannon House Office building where he had his office, and he saw him coming, he would go the other way. And the reason was most members don't want to vote on trade. It's a no-win vote, because there's always going to be someone out there that thinks they're being hurt by trade, and those that are beneficiaries of trade, all of us as consumers, as we get more choice, more variety, lower prices, so inflation is less. Those benefits are diffuse throughout the economy, but the losses are concentrated, and if you lose from a trade agreement, you know it. And so most members are gun shy, and they would rather the trade issue and the trade debate just go away. Yes?
Mr. Hearn, just for clarification, you mentioned that, if I understood correctly, that the Doha is being slowed down or held up by the reps fearing that they'll lose certain protections. Do I understand that correctly?
Right.
I thought that one of their concerns, one of the reasons that they're fighting so hard in the Doha is because the United States and the EU are saying they will maintain certain protections, which is making it very hard for them to compete, say, in agricultural markets.
That's the argument. Clearly, United States and the EU provide major subsidies to agriculture. And boy, I would think now would be a great time for the United States to take the initiative and go back to Doha and say, look, we're actually going to be cutting our agricultural subsidies. We have to do that as a part of this super committee and deficit reduction mandate. But it hasn't happened, and the EU reached its limit in terms of agricultural subsidy liberalization in 2008, and they don't want to go back and renegotiate that internally difficult bargain. But what Europe and the United States both want from the reps are a reduction of their barriers to manufactured goods, an opening of services markets, and so forth. India doesn't want any agricultural liberalization. I mean, they have 500, 600 million very poor people that have to, with small scale plots. So they're living off the land, and they're just scared, the government would fall if they opened up. That's what their argument is. Brazil, on the other hand, wants our agricultural liberalization. They can export to the rest of the world. And when it comes to reduction of manufactured goods barriers, Brazil and India are more scared of China than anywhere else. They're not scared of the United States or Europe. So many people argue that their reluctance to reduce their tariffs on manufactured goods and reduce their non-tariff barriers to exports of manufactured goods to their home markets are a reflection of their being worried about Chinese competition and not U.S. So it's a very complicated dynamic, but the point is that their position in the world now is such that they can gum up the works. They can say no and nothing's going to move forward. In the old days, basically the United States would propose an agenda, and if we could get agreement with Europe, that's all that was needed, and then successive rounds of multilateral trade liberalization went forward. The world's not as simple now, and it goes back to one of those first slides where there's this shift in global economic power, and we're no longer the big guy on the block, or the biggest guy on the block that can move things forward. We've got a bargain. Pain is shared by all sectors of our economy, by all constituencies. I would look for tax increases or revenues to be 1/3 to 1/2 of the solution, and spending cuts the other half. I would look for putting money into R&D, education, and other areas that are investments for our future. That's what needs to be done. But that's nothing new. I mean, most mainstream economists would argue that that's what needs to be done, but there's something called Washington, and it's not working well. So, and they have different views on spending and taxing, and right now it's a big problem. In terms of the foreign economic agenda, it's hard to say. I mean, it really is hard to say. I think we have to somehow, and I'll get to this later, develop a policy to attract investment. Most high-paying jobs now are associated with the world economy in some fashion. So if you're working for a multinational corporation, you're going to be earning good money, higher than you would be in most service sectors that are not competing internationally. So that's an area you want to be in. But our own multinationals now, 50% of their employment, 50% of their revenue or more are generated internationally. So we've got to attract some of these companies, foreign multinationals, to the United States. Right now we have a policy of, foreign direct investment policy is one of neutrality, neither to encourage or discourage foreign investment. And I think that's not serving us necessarily well, because all the other countries in the world are attracting foreign investment. And what we have is a situation where all state governments have very active programs at attracting foreign investment. They have missions to get companies to locate over here, but they compete with each other, providing subsidies and all that. So that as a country, it's not necessarily working as well as it could if we had a different mix of priorities. Oh, this trade stats. As I said before, nothing's really made in America anymore. It's made in the world. And when it comes to stuff like the U.S. trade deficit with China, well, we get the numbers. We're importing $450 billion more than we're exporting to China, and that's our trade deficit. But of that amount, the value added that Chinese factors of production are adding is 20 to 35%. So it's not necessarily a lot of value added. And many of our companies that Fortune 500 that are invested in China are exporting back to the United States. And so that's part of the data as well. So if you believe in the global economy, that part of what is going on is accruing benefits to U.S. factors of production through this. Here you see the iPod example I alluded to before. And this illustrates how the production of this iPod supports twice as many jobs overseas. It's about 27,000 jobs overseas than U.S. jobs. U.S. jobs associated with the production of the iPod estimated at around 14,000. But the bulk of the earnings from the production of the iPod, 70% actually go to the United States. This is because of the 27,000 foreign jobs, 14% were engineers and other professionals compared to 40% of total U.S. jobs. But in terms of U.S. trade politics and the battle between capital and labor, of course, this is just an anecdote. And anecdotes are, everyone's got an anecdote. But how much this represents what's going on in our economy, it's hard to say. On the question of better rules for foreign investment, let me just reiterate that point that it's not a question as much of rules as I think about it. It's more a question about having an activist policy to attract foreign direct investment. So we'll go to the next slide. We're running out of time. Commodity price impacts. So the demand outstripping the supply, and you guys know more about that, whether or not there's going to be technological breakthroughs in these various areas. But the more important point is the impacts so far could include and have included higher inflation and slower world growth. And the impacts could vary across countries, pitting producers against consumers, and increasing political tensions related to the control of commodity sourcing. Reform of the IMF and bank. As I mentioned, these reps want more power. We want them to take on more responsibilities, and there's a big tug of war going on. They want more representation, and they want that on their own terms. Some changes have occurred in both the IMF and the World Bank, making them more representative of the distribution of global economic power today, but more needs to be done. There's a new forum out there called the G20, which is a reflection of this changing distribution of economic power. So the G20 has sort of superseded the G7, which was the advanced countries getting together and trying to make decisions on not only monitoring the global economy, but then coming up with a consensus way of moving policies in a similar direction so the world economy would keep growing. Now the G20 includes all of the reps plus Argentina, Saudi Arabia, and a few others. And it did really useful work during the 08-09 financial crisis because it contributed to policy consensus that the reps, because they had the resources, could stimulate their economies. They did that, and as a result, the world economy still grew due to the fact that they didn't adopt contractionary policies. Since that 08-09 period, which was the heyday of the G20 really hasn't done much. They have a meeting coming up in November where they'll be looking at concerted or coordinated action to help out in the Eurozone crisis. We'll see if that happens. So what's the outlook? How does this affect us overall, the rise of the reps? I think most economists would say that it's a win-win situation. If someone else gets richer, it doesn't make us poorer. And most economists would argue there are always these trade involves mutual benefits. And the rising economic powers are going to make the pie bigger, and millions, hundreds of millions will escape poverty. That's good for us. We shouldn't be afraid of that. Our living standards will continue to rise in absolute terms, except that we just won't be as relatively big as we were before in the world economy. So most economists, I think, would take that position. Others are more skeptical. They say the reps are impacting the structure of our economy already through very interventionist policies. And it's clear that if you're highly educated, highly skilled, you can thrive in today's global economy. But if you're lower skilled, the outlook is going to be a lot different. And that by their interventions, the reps are distorting comparative advantage. So that this is the other argument. If we don't adopt interventionist policy of our own, particularly towards manufacturing, industrial policies, favoring manufacturing, then what we have as a manufacturing sector will be a function of their interventions. So it will be the residual of what they do. That's what laissez-faire would get us. So on the other side then are people that are critical of the way the global economy is evolving, critical of the reps and how they could influence our economic future. And then finally, you've got more folks in the foreign policy arena, and they're concerned about US influence and leadership. They say money talks. We don't have the money anymore, so we're not going to have the influence. And finally, after all of this, beware of what I've said. So this is a huge qualification, huge caveat. Projecting these trends is hazardous business. Remember when John Kennedy came to office in 1960, he was told by the CIA that the Soviet Union economy was bigger than the US economy, or going to be bigger, and actually it was a mess. That's not really a projection, but you don't know what's really going on inside these economies sometimes. You don't really know. Of course, in the 1990s, we had all the stories about Japan. It's number one. Most Japanese guys are my height, and basically everyone was saying these guys were, 6'7", the height I used to be, and they aren't that tall. And what happened was they had bubbles, they had problems, and they weren't able to get their act together, partly due to political stalemate. Some people would argue mostly due to political stalemate. And then the internal challenges. You guys know the internal challenges each of these countries faces. China, income inequality, an aging population, water shortages, pollution, corruption, weak banking sector. So they've got to eventually, given the fact that the advanced countries are not going to be growing at rapid rates, and they're not going to have large growing markets, they're going to have to rely on their own population, internal demand to grow more. So they've got to change their economic model, but that takes time. And it also, there are huge vested interests in these countries that are going to fight these kinds of changes. And also, that point, going from poor to middle income is easier than going from middle income to rich. Certainly applies to China today. Right now, China is, let's put it this way, our business community, big business community, the multinational companies, are more concerned about Chinese industrial policy. China forcing companies, for example, to transfer technology for high-tech industries than they are concerned about the value of the renminbi, currency issue. This is China's current way of overcoming this gap, going from middle income to rich, because rich countries need technology. They have to eventually, to be a rich country, you have to innovate, be able to develop stuff. And so that's where China's challenge is today. They know it, they're worried, their education system is such that learning by memorization and so forth, so the Steve Jobs of the world, they don't have. We don't have them either now anymore, either, unfortunately. So anyway, India, mass education, God, what a disaster. I lived out there for a couple of years. Infrastructure is terrible. Corruption is rampant. Bureaucratic red tape. I mean, where would you rather be? In the United States doing business or in India? That's one of the reasons the big Indian multinationals come here. Doing business there is very hard. You got to be paying people off all the time. So I come to the final question, and ultimately, whether or not these trends that we're talking about accelerate, whether the gap grows between the advanced countries, the United States and Europe, and the reps, or whether it shrinks, partly depend on whether we can get our own act together. Because if we can grow faster, the gap is going to be less. So that's how I come down. You don't need to be, as they say, a rocket scientist to figure this out. But anyway, that's my conclusion. And now, in the 10 minutes that are left, if we have questions, I'd be happy to. Yes?
I'm just curious how so you prepared this wonderful report. How does it get used by Congress? Do you come to hearings? Do you find that? Well,
this is an unusual report in that it really was a think piece, because we hadn't done anything at CRS on the so-called rising economic powers of the BRICS. And I was tasked with doing it. There was a committee interested in it. And they wanted to know what are the kind of policy challenges being raised by this shift of wealth from advanced countries to developing countries. And so there was a lot done. And this is not my original research. I'm relying on, I should have said earlier, Brookings Institution, Carnegie Foundation, and then international institutions such as the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the IMF, the World Bank, World Trade Organization. They've all done great studies, which I've relied on and footnoted. But they haven't done anything on what does it mean for the United States? What does it mean for US policy? So my tasking was to take the trends and then try to figure out in various policy areas, how does it affect us? And it just really touches the surface.
But I think he was also asking how do members of Congress get that
Oh,
information?
how do they get that information? Well, oftentimes we'll write a report like this and it's a big black box. You don't hear from anyone. This time I wrote the report Maybe it was a slow, very slow week in Congress. But I heard from 5 staffers. And one said, it's an amazing report. Can I come talk to you about it? And I said, sure, come on over. He says, well, I'm getting married this weekend. Can we wait till I get married? And I said, sure, no problem. So I'm meeting with him on Friday. And then the committee I wrote it with, they're looking at it, and eventually they're considering doing a hearing on some aspect of it, but I haven't heard anything definitive. But, you know, basically, if by this report I'm able to stimulate some discussions, some thinking in Congress on the topic, and it leads to a hearing, you know, it's a success. Oftentimes I hear from no one, and you know, and so you wonder, you know, is anyone awake out there? But yes.
Well, I find that sort of interesting because this discussion of rising economic powers is pretty heavy around LAIS here, and I'm sure at lots of other universities, and certainly a lot of multinationals. So it's very much the topic of conversation in print media and in universities. The fact that Congress is just now thinking perhaps maybe should have a hearing seems kind of a little behind the 8 ball to me. And you know, does it feel that way to you, or is that just how Congress works?
Is this on the record or not? But no, I mean,
Turn off the tape.
well, on the one hand, one could argue, yes, it seems a little late in the day and so forth. And to Congress's credit, many people have thought about this. I'm not the first one, and there have been multiple hearings on China. But it hasn't been cast, I don't think, in terms of a larger phenomenon, a larger trend. That's my view. And so I hope that you know, the report will have some impact. And what was the second part of your question then? It was.
Just
oh.
No, it wasn't really.
Okay.
It's just more of a comment than anything. It just seems amazing to me that, you know, trade policy on a U.S. level, and it certainly comes down to your last piece, you know, can the U.S. get its act together, that this seems to be something that, you know, our government should be focused on, and it doesn't sound like it is.
Well, you know, and here again, you stated it very nicely in terms of what the problem is. I think there is recognition of the problem, but the real problem is getting agreement on a plan to do something about it. Because in any of these policy areas I've mentioned, there's no agreement on what to do. You know, it's great division. So, you know, I've often told people that if you got a problem, sometimes it really doesn't matter what the plan you have adopted. Just get a plan. You know, some plan is better than another, but we can't even seem to, which is not always true, you know, but we can't even seem to get a plan to address some of these problems. We talk about it, and the Obama export initiative, I mean, ever since Eisenhower, every administration has adopted export promotion initiatives. Every administration, you know, and said, look, we got to be part of the global economy. We've got to make exporting more important. Wake up, America. And then, you know, and then if you read the initiative, the same underlying propositions are put forth that were put forth in the 1950s. With certain, you know, updates that, you know, but this basic premise. Yes? Is that George Mason?
Yes.
Oh.
I'm familiar with DC. But Ernst & Young and Forbes recently cited resource nationalism as being one of the primary threats to business investment and investment interests. And so in other countries. And so I was wondering what kinds of options there might be for the U.S. government to...
Yeah, I have to beg off on that because that's something I really haven't looked at, and I'm sorry. Maybe somewhat resource nationalism and what options there are for the U.S. Does anyone here have views on that could tend to answer the question?
Are you talking about, Mario, are you talking about nationalizing resource industry?
Yeah.
Nationalizing resource intensive or resources.
Like our mines and, yeah, I mean,
Not
where are
the
you
US.
at in other countries?
Not US. I'm talking about other countries and where, and it's constricting U.S. investment in some places where that's a growth trend.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure, I mean, that's definitely an issue there.
Yeah, but I'm sorry,
What ways
I can't address it. No, I mean, only in that if it's a nationalized industry, then you would hope that under the WTO, World Trade Organization, there are certain rules that deal with government ownership of industry, but I'm not sure the WTO purview extends to natural resources. Like energy seems to be a way outside the purview of, you've got OPEC and all that, but.
One thing I know is that Goldfields, which has an office here, they're a South African company, and they're actually, we just talked to them extensively last semester, and they're pulling out of South Africa altogether because South Africa keeps talking about nationalization, and they believe that the African National Congress will eventually move on that, and they don't want to be there when that happens. So,
Okay.
yeah, I know that's an issue in a number of places. I don't know what U.S. policy, the U.S. has any particular policy issues on that, or how they would get involved in that.
Okay. Anything else? First you, and then over here.
I have a question about the South-South trade.
Yeah.
I would like to know the main export between the South-South, like what? Like the raw materials like that? Because China
Yeah.
buy lots of, the.
Yeah. Yeah, China to the rest of the world would be manufactured goods, and it's buying
Yeah,
commodities.
yeah,
But
minus
a lot of the, like India has services actually exports, and obviously services exports, but also some manufactured exports to not to South Asia, but to East Asia, Southeast Asia, and it's not all commodities. No, I mean I think it's substantial amount of that is manufactured goods. I don't have the data though to back that up. Yes.
Do you see any, say in the next 15 to 20 years, more FDI South-South as opposed to?
Yeah, well, there is actually some of the biggest multinationals in China, India, and Brazil are wanting to invest in the United States and advanced countries more than in their home country. It's kind of curious because they see a better business environment, less regulation, less license, and all that. So, but they are also obviously investing in their home markets. Yeah.
I'm so,
Okay.
you're going to get a half hour with him afterwards. So
Okay.
I'm going to, we're going to stop right here.
Okay.
And we'll let Mr. Ingham take a break. So thank you very much for your
Thank you.